You may be seated. I confess to you as I come today, based on this particular passage we're studying today, I'm not a fisherman. I did not grow up in a household or in a family of folks who saw fishing as a life of hobby or as a profession. So I really hadn't been around fishing much until I went to college, and I had a roommate who loved to fish. And so he suggested one weekend, we both had some time off, that we would go to his house and we'd go out with his dad in fishing. So we did. And so before we left, his dad was telling us about he had found a new place, a new cove that he thought we would enjoy. So he was going to send us that way, he would go another way. And so we had two small boats, and so we went out. And he went one way and we went the other way, went down the cove where he told us, and we thought we found a good place to fish. Well, as the story goes, very similar to what was in the Bible story for us today, we threw our lines in and we were there a long time. Seemed like an eternity that we were there, and neither one of us caught anything. And we just kept there. We enjoyed each other's company, but after a while it got a little frustrating that we weren't being productive. And so his dad came back by and he said, "Well, how's it going?" He had evidently been very successful, and we said, "Well, we just hadn't caught anything." And he says, "Well, you're in the wrong place." "How do we know?" And he says, "Actually, if you go over there by that stump, that's the place." And literally, it was only 15 feet away. And so sure enough, we moved the boat over there, and within 3 minutes, throwing our nets and our lines in the water, we both caught 2 fish, just like that. So, I know what it's like to be in a position like that. And interestingly, as he started his boat and kind of went away from us, going back to the shore, he says, "Just like in the Bible," is what he shouted. And I had forgotten about that story until I actually began to prepare for this. Sometimes it makes a difference where we are and what we're doing at the time. And so, first of all, I want to put in some context for you, this particular setting that we have. And I'm going to show a few pictures that are going to be up here. The first one is a satellite picture of the Sea of Galilee. And you'll see in the northern tip there of the sea, you'll see Capernaum, and just to the west of that is the Mount of Beatitudes. And by tradition, this is the location of this particular story, or somewhere in that vicinity. And so you see that is there, the northern part of that. You also see on this next picture, on the Sea of Galilee, and this was a picture I took early in the morning, and usually the morning the sea is calm. But on this particular day, you can see a couple of whitecaps there. And sometimes the wind begins to blow in a way that it creates the storm on the sea. And we have actually heard that story before of being on the sea. And I have been on the Sea of Galilee when it got very, very rough. And so it's not an easy feeling that we have being there. So in this particular picture, there are a few whitecaps, but it's still kind of calm. The thing that makes this significant is 44 miles north of the Sea of Galilee is Mount Hermon. Now, Mount Hermon is a little over 9,000 feet tall. It's the only place in Israel that's snow-covered 12 months out of the year. And 44 miles away is the Sea of Galilee, which is 695 feet below sea level. So in a 45-mile range, it drops through the Jordan Valley into the Sea of Galilee. And on this next picture that you see, you can actually see the Sea of Galilee from the Mount of Beatitudes. And you can see the Golan Heights on the left side, and you can see the Sapori mountain range on the right side. And this is what creates the wind tunnel coming down from the mountains into the Sea of Galilee and makes the sea very rough. And at times, it is very difficult to fish because of the way the wind and the storms come. And because the Sea of Galilee is so low, the storms coming over the mountain aren't seen until they're almost on top of you. But yet on this Mount of Beatitudes, as you go from the mount down to the Sea of Galilee, there are several caves along there. And these are what we call the Spotters' Caves. And these were the locations that individuals would actually stand and direct the fishermen on the Sea of Galilee. They would be able to see from the perch high above that where the schools of fish were actually moving. So it was not unusual for somebody to say, go over there, that's where the fish are, just like Jesus has done for the fishermen this day. And in this particular story that we have disciples coming to fish because they don't know what else to do, it appears. They are despondent over Jesus' death, and they even say, Peter says, well, I don't guess there's anything else to do. I'm going fishing, because that's what he knew to do. And the disciples said, well, we'll go along with you. So the story tells about how they've been out on the sea all night. And because of the rough seas during the day, just like many places where in the afternoon the heat builds up and the storms come, many fishermen would fish literally all night long. And in the early morning, as the dawn begins to rise, they would head towards the coastline to be in a safer position. So in this story, they've been out all night. And as they're coming back in, they hear this guy on the shore say, hey, did you catch any fish? No, we didn't. And I'm sure, I don't know if this is the first time they've been fishing since all this happened, but at least I'm sure they're disappointed, because the trade that they knew, they haven't been successful at this particular day. And so the individual on the shore says, hey, throw your nets on the other side of the boat. Okay, these are professional fishermen. And you would think this is kind of a silly thing to do, just to throw your net on the other side. In fact, it's kind of a dumb thing to do, because we've been out here all night, and surely if they're not on one side of the boat, they're not going to be on the other. But yet they do it. And then the Bible says when they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. They're stunned because all of a sudden the fish are there. And then the Bible goes on to say, then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it's the Lord. Now, at this point, maybe they do recognize him, but there's something else that I think gives us a clue about them understanding who it is on the shoreline, because this is not the first time they've encountered this situation. In the 5th chapter of the Gospel of Luke, there's the story of Jesus coming to this particular cove, and he's standing there and he's preaching and teaching to the people, and the large crowd begins to gather. And he's feeling kind of pressed and pushed down towards the Sea of Galilee. And there are 2 boats sitting there, and he gets into one of them, which turns out to be Simon's boat. And he says, push me off from shore so I can teach to the people. And so he preaches and he teaches. And after they've been there a while, he says, let's just go on out a little farther and drop the nets. Well, Simon says, look, we've been fishing all night long and we've caught nothing. So what's going to be the difference now? But if you say so, we will. And he throws the nets in. And the story tells us that there were so many fish that the nets began to tear. And he called the other boat, and they came out, and both boats were full of fish. So we have this story playing out again in the lives of the fishermen. In fact, Jesus' relationship appears to be with these disciples beginning and ending with this miraculous catch of fish. Now, I think this story gives us several stories or several things that we can learn from this. The first thing is important to listen and obey Jesus in our lives. It's good advice, but in both stories, it's difficult, I think, for the fishermen to fully grasp and understand what they need to do. They're probably the best fishermen on the Sea of Galilee, they would think. And Jesus is suggesting to do something that seems to be rather unusual at this point. What possible difference could it make just to throw your nets on the other side? Sometimes in life, I think we find ourselves in that situation where we don't really have an answer for the situation we're in. We don't really know what we need to do. And then someone gives us something very simplistic to do that at the time seems foolish maybe. like the time when you lose something and you're searching all over for it, and somebody will say, well, have you looked where you saw it last? No, I didn't think of that. Wow, of course we did. We've looked where we've looked before. We look all over. And it seems to be very simplistic. But yet sometimes it's where we left it last. It's at the place that we would not assume. So we have this, and we look all over the place. And have you looked at the last place? And perhaps Jesus is asking us to do something as simplistic as that. We've been fishing on the left side of the boat our whole lives. We know that the left side of the boat is productive, but for whatever reason, it's not right now. And instead of throwing our net on the other side, we keep going to the left side. We keep going to the side that we know is best. And in this story, we have Jesus doing his simple thing of saying, just try something different. Listen to what I'm saying and put it on the other side. Now, to me, this story also raises several other questions. Why didn't Jesus just have the fish swim to the other side of the boat? If that's where the nets were, why don't you just have the fish go that way, to the other side? Or maybe, why even do you need nets at all? Why didn't Jesus just have the fish jump in the boat? Well, we all know that's not how it really works. And I think even though Jesus, as we understand it, probably had the power to do those things, it was out of a sense of obedience that the disciples followed his lead. It was out of a sense of being a fully devoted follower of Jesus that they did what he said. But we also know they are professional fishermen, and this guy is a carpenter. How would he know anything about fishing? Sometimes it takes humility on our part. Sometimes it takes us realizing we don't always have the answers. Now, some of us, me included, have a difficult time sometimes taking advice from others because I think I know what the answer is and should be. And maybe it's something that's been successful before. And sometimes it's thinking out of the box and thinking differently than we usually do that we are able to do what God has called us to do. Jesus wants us to have a teachable spirit. And sometimes we have to humble ourselves to be able to hear what someone else is saying, as simplistic as it might be. There's a passage in the 51st Psalm from King David that says, return the joy of your salvation to me and sustain me with what? A willing heart. We have to open our hearts to the ways that God would speak to us. We have to be willing to listen to Jesus and do what Jesus says. The second lesson I think we learn from this is often we meet God when we have come to the end of our own personal resources. When we've done everything that we know to do and still haven't quite let it go to God. It's only at that point that we fully hear and understand what God is calling us to do. Simon Peter was certainly at the end of his resources. He had boasted to everyone else that no matter who else left Jesus, he was going to be faithful to him. He was going to be the one to stay with Jesus. And yet we know he denied him 3 times. He failed Jesus. And when Peter met Jesus in the first passage of this passage we read today, it's in the Luke passage, Simon says when he meets Jesus for the first time after that first miraculous catch, I am a sinner. And at that he fell on his knees and he almost said, I'm not worthy. But it was when the disciples came to the end of their own resources, that is when they had the miraculous catch. That is when they had, as the Bible tells us, 153 large fish in the boats. But in the pressure on the nets did still not break. When everything else we have tried and nothing works, Jesus sometimes has something that we can make out of nothing. Jesus makes that for us, and we live into it. When we reach the end ourselves, we come to the beginning of our relationship with Christ. The third lesson I think we learn from this story is you have to put your net in where the fish are. That was a simple story I had learned on that little small fishing trip that I had. But the answer is often closer than we think it is, if we'll just turn it over to the one who loves us. The answer is often closer than we would ever imagine. You know, it's interesting that the fish that the fishermen were wanting was not in another lake. In fact, it was not even on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. It was right there in their midst. And all they had to do was do as Christ told him. And if we let Jesus be our spotter in our life to help us know where we can accomplish great things for God, we too can follow. Wade Hughes Sr. is an Assembly of God preacher. And in a sermon that he wrote entitled Pushing the Rock, he tells the story of a man who was weak and frail, who was sickly in life, and who had tried everything he could to get well, but nothing seemed to work. And in the midst of a prayer time where he turned it over to God, the story goes, Jesus came to him and he said, "You need to do this for me. Right outside of your house, there's a boulder, and I want you to push on that boulder. And each day when you get up, spend your day pushing on that boulder. And you push on that boulder till I tell you you've pushed enough." And so each day he went on and pushed. And minute after minute and hour after hour he pushed. Day after day he pushed, which became weeks, and then weeks became months. And the story goes, after 8 months, he realized that he had been pushing the boulder all that time and the boulder had yet to move. So he took a measuring stick and he went from the front porch to where the boulder was, and he measured how far it was, and he continued to push. And each day he looked and the boulder has not moved. And so finally, at the end of the story, it says that he was despondent. He was crying because he didn't feel like he was doing it well enough, that he was being responsive to God. And the story goes that Jesus came and joined him on the porch and says, "Why are you crying, my child?" And he says, "You know, I've been pushing this boulder all this time, and it has not moved a fraction of an inch." And Jesus says, "But have you seen yourself lately? Take a good look at yourself. You're strong because you've been pushing on that boulder. You're no longer sickly because you've been pushing on that boulder. You have accomplished a great deal by pushing on the boulder. And oh, by the way, I never told you the boulder was going to move. All I asked you to do was to push." And it is when we push against the rock that we become strong. Whether the rock moves or not, it doesn't matter. It is when we obey and we cast our nets on the side that Christ has called us to do, is when the nets are filled. And a way is open for each of us to have a deeper following in our relationship with Jesus Christ. Oh God, we thank you that you give us the ability to push and to move and to cast our nets where you have called us to go. Let us pray. Oh God, we do thank you for the miraculous way that you move in our lives, for the things you have called us to be and do in your name. And we ask that you continue to guide in all that we do, that we would be faithful to your call upon our life, both this day and forevermore. Amen. Our hymn is 378, Amazing Grace. We'll be singing verses